Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 76 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today's episode is another solo episode where I share some of my own research from the past couple of years. This time I'll be covering a number of the mysterious and mostly unsolved deaths which are tied to espionage from World War II up through modern times. As I'm sure you realize, despite the fact that the Cold War superpowers never entered into direct conflict with each other, casualties mounted on both sides for decades. Many people directly involved in espionage or covert action met untimely ends. Some of these may have been suicides or perhaps were just staged to appear as such. Others are deaths that were given a straightforward explanation or culprit, but are still met with doubt and discussion as to the true nature of events. This is not by any means a complete accounting of every mysterious or unsolved death over a period of more than 40 years, but today you'll hear accounts of what I consider to be a few of the most intriguing stories since World War II began. If you've been listening to the podcast from the beginning, then you've heard me discuss some really interesting stories like these before, such as episode 26 about David Arturo Baez Cruz, the former Green Beret who joined the Sandinistas and was most likely captured and executed by Honduran Special Forces in 1983. There's also episode 60, the story of Jerry Daniels, found dead in his apartment in Bangkok, Thailand, supposedly of carbon monoxide poisoning. And the story of Freddie Woodruff in episode 61, who was shot to death while serving in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia in 1993, but whose alleged murderer was an innocent man framed in a massive cover-up. I've also left out a couple of deaths that I intend to devote an entire episode to in the future. For example, John Paisley, who appears to have committed suicide while sailing on the Chesapeake Bay, but whose death might have actually been staged. So stay tuned after this episode for more stories of mysterious and unexplained deaths sometime in the future. But before we dive into these stories, I want to say a big thank you to everyone listening who is also supporting me on Patreon, including James H. and Brian A. Your monthly contributions there help me keep this podcast going week in and week out. As a way of thanking my patrons, I offer a lot of great freebies and promotions, including free and discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. Patrons also get exclusive access to long-form articles of mine that aren't available anywhere else. If you haven't signed up for my Patreon yet, but you want to, just click the link in the show notes on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. One of the most enduring mysteries of all is one that I've covered briefly on the podcast already. You may recall the story of Walter Kravitsky, who was discussed for just a few minutes during episode 66 with my guest FBI historian Ray Batvinis. Walter Kravitsky was the Soviet defector who became one of Joseph Stalin's first assassination targets outside the Soviet Union. Kravitsky was a diehard communist who participated in the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin, when he was just 18 years old. Kravitsky remained with the Soviet government for the next 20 years as a member of the brand new Cheka organization led by Felix Dzerzhinsky, which was one of the most fearsome secret police agencies to ever exist. He later served as an agent of the NKVD, which replaced the Cheka, before eventually rising to the position of Chief of Soviet Military Intelligence in Western Europe. He lived in Copenhagen with his wife, and from there he directed clandestine activities all over the continent. Although he never lost his far-left ideology, Kravitsky gradually became sickened by Stalin's secret collaborations with the Third Reich leading up to the beginning of the Second World War. The final straw for him was when Stalin gave Hitler tacit permission to invade Czechoslovakia, by stating there would be no war between Germany and the Soviet Union. This was the very famous Ribbentrop Pact of non-aggression. Krivitsky also slowly came to grips with the vast inequalities that existed in the Soviet Union even after 20 years of communist rule. He lived a life of high privilege as a Communist Party leader, but his incidental exposure to some of the poorest rural areas caused him to realize that true communism was not being practiced, as the saying goes, and Stalin was just another power-mad dictator. Then, in 1937, while assigned to a station in The Hague, Krivitsky's friend Ignacy Reis defected after sending a letter to Stalin announcing his intention. The two men had been friends since they were teenagers in a communist youth group together. By the time Reis defected, Stalin's infamous purges were well underway within the Soviet Union, and many of Reis and Krivitsky's friends and associates had already been recalled to the USSR and subsequently either imprisoned, executed, or disappeared entirely. Killers from an NKVD mobile group caught Reis in Switzerland a few months later and shot him to death. Krivitsky had been on the fence about defecting until then. The following month, he fled to France from The Hague, where he was debriefed extensively. The information that he provided there over the next year allowed for the arrest of several Soviet agents in the United Kingdom. He also provided clues to the identities of other spies, but unfortunately, the information he had was insufficient to fully identify them. As it later turned out, he had knowledge of two of the infamous Cambridge 5 spies, John Cairncross and Donald MacLean. Meanwhile, other Soviet agents were either being recalled or killed in far-flung locales as Stalin's Great Purge commenced. Many of Krivitsky's friends, co-workers, and associates died during the purges, very few of whom had been disloyal to the state. So near the end of 1938, Krivitsky decided to travel to the United States because of the impending war about to sweep across Europe. Once he settled in the United States, he began cooperating with the U.S. government and published a book titled In Stalin's Secret Service, which described the methods and goals of Soviet intelligence. Although this book would prove to be an incredibly valuable reference in the coming years, the U.S. was almost completely focused on the looming threat of Nazi Germany and the Axis powers, and paid almost no attention to the communist spies, which by that time had fully penetrated the government at almost all levels. He also testified before Congress on Soviet intelligence activities and befriended another turncoat Soviet agent named Whittaker Chambers. Chambers would go on to testify himself to the activities of a U.S. State Department employee named Alger Hiss, one of the most famous traitors in American history. Throughout his time in the public spotlight, Krivitsky spoke loudly and often of his fears of Soviet killers, and it appears his fears were well justified. On the morning of February 10th, 1941, he was found dead of a single gunshot wound in room 524 of the Bellevue Hotel in Washington, D.C. A .38 caliber pistol was in his hand, and there were 3 suicide notes in Russian, German, and English in the room, all in his handwriting. Police were called, and the body was taken to the medical examiner, but for some reason, D.C. police did not order the hotel staff to leave the room untouched. So the room itself was cleaned up by the maids not long after Krivitsky's body was removed, which likely destroyed any forensic evidence that might have proven valuable later. Since then, his death has prompted endless discussion. The best single source on Krivitsky's death that I have found is the book A Death in Washington by Gary Kern. Gary spent nearly 20 years investigating the case beginning in 1985 and put together a tremendously thorough look at Krivitsky's life and death. In the end, there are 3 likely scenarios for what happened. Either he was murdered and the suicide was faked, or he was forced to kill himself, or Krivitsky simply chose to end his own life. There is compelling evidence for all 3 scenarios, and none of them can be entirely ruled out. If he was murdered, one of the most likely suspects that Gary names in his book is George Mink. George Mink also was known as Gody Minkowski. He was a union organizer, a Communist Party member, and an assassin for Joseph Stalin, who operated in the United States and in Europe throughout the 1930s. Mink immigrated from Russia in 1913, changing his name from Minkowski once he arrived in the U.S. After a short stint in the U.S. Navy, which lasted just 6 months before he was medically discharged, Mink began work in the maritime industry. He soon joined a workers' union where he was made a leader, and by 1921 he joined the Communist Party of the USA. Throughout the 1920s, Mink steadily rose through the ranks of the Communist Party of the United States. At the same time, he ascended to national chairman of the Maritime Workers Industrial Union, which he personally grew from an initial 24 members to over 6,000, divided across 11 different chapters. His high position within the Communist Party took him all the way to Moscow in the early 1930s, where he was trained as an international operative of the OGPU, secret police organization, before being tasked to spy on suspected dissident Communist Party members and even eliminate them. Mink killed at least 5 people between May 1932 and January 1940. 1 in Hamburg, Germany, 2 in Barcelona, Spain, 1 in Lausanne, Switzerland, and 1 in Aberdeen, Washington State in the United States. He has also been tied to the failed assassination attempt on Leon Trotsky in Mexico City in May 1940. Trotsky was very famously killed with an ice axe to the head just 3 months later by Ramon Mercader, part of a separate mobile group which operated independently of Mink. There were also other instances of deaths and disappearances in Europe in the 1930s which were attached to Mink, but none are definitive. Afterwards, the FBI searched for Mink for years, but there is no indication he ever turned up in the United States again. His ultimate whereabouts and demise are unknown to this day. As with many of the long-standing mysteries I've covered in the past, this is one that will probably never be answered with complete certainty. But Gary Kern's book, Death in Washington, is probably the closest thing we'll ever get to a complete telling of Krivitsky's story. Next is the story of James Kronthal. On March 31st, 1953, James Speyer Kronthal was found dead by suicide in his Georgetown home. Kronthal was a high-ranking member of the Central Intelligence Agency and one of the first 60 people hired in 1947 by its first director, Allen Dulles. He may also have been under the control of the Soviet NKVD intelligence organization, and if so, he was probably their most highly placed agent within the CIA in history. Some of his story seems well established, while other parts are heavily contested by several different parties. Here to begin with are the facts that are mostly settled. On the morning of his death, one of Kronthal's co-workers called his housekeeper, Lavinia Thomas, after he failed to arrive for work and missed an important meeting. She was unable to reach him by phone, and when she arrived at his house, she found a note on the front door stating he did not want to be disturbed. 2 of his co-workers then drove to his house and entered, waiting politely downstairs for a short period in the hopes that he would wake up and exit the bedroom at some point. After a few minutes, one of them finally went upstairs and opened his bedroom door. There he found Kronthal lying in bed, still dressed in his pajamas and obviously dead. He had left a note on the bedside table addressed to Richard Helms, who would later be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. An empty container with military markings on it was found nearby, and the employees deduced that he had taken a suicide pill or L-tablet originally issued to him years before when he was in the Office of Strategic Services during the Second World War. So, from the outset, his death was presumed to be suicide by poison. Years earlier, long before the war began, Kronthal was a member of the Ivy League set that produced so many founding members of the OSS and CIA. He attended Yale University, where he graduated in 1934 with a degree in art history. Afterwards, he moved to New York City and joined his father, who worked for the investment banking firm Speyer & Company. Kronthal worked as a financial analyst and art broker for the firm. In 1938, 4 years after he began working at Speyer & Company, the firm was liquidated. The 102-year-old agency was a victim of changing laws in international banking, as well as rising anti-Semitic sentiment in both the United States and Europe. From there, Kronthal went to Harvard University to complete a master's degree in history and worked as an assistant instructor to one of its history professors. By 1942, war was raging in Europe, and the entire United States population and industry were mobilizing for a fight on 2 different fronts. Kronthal's Ivy League education and his fluency in French and German made him a shoo-in for intelligence work. Just months after the U.S. entered the war, he joined the newly founded Office of the Coordinator of Strategic Information, headed by General William Wild Bill Donovan on the orders of President Roosevelt. The COI was soon replaced by the Office of Strategic Services, which Donovan took charge of as well. Subsequently, Kronthal enlisted in the U.S. Army in the fall of 1942, and, after completing basic training, was assigned to the OSS for the duration of the war. He then served in both the Strategic Services Unit and the Central Intelligence Group, the two short-lived organizations which were born in rapid succession out of the post-war demise of the OSS. He worked primarily as an intelligence analyst in all three organizations. As one of the first few dozen employees of the new CIA, he was appointed Chief of Station in Bern, Switzerland, the same post which Allen Dulles himself held during the war. After his tour in Bern, he was promoted to GS-15 and transferred back to Washington, D.C., where he worked until his suicide in March of 1953. More than 35 years after his death, a book called Widows, written by William Corson and Joseph and Susan Trento, was published in 1989 and made some startling and never-before-publicized allegations about Kronthal's work and personal life. These allegations were so serious that immediately after the book was published, the CIA launched an internal investigation to determine if any of the allegations were true. The investigation reached very different conclusions from the book, but it was not declassified until January 2020. So there are essentially two different versions of Kronthal's life to choose from, both of which contradict the other. In Widows, the three authors wrote that while he worked at Speyer & Company between 1934 and 1938, Kronthal conducted some highly distasteful and seedy business dealing with the Nazi government in Germany on behalf of the firm. As the Third Reich increasingly targeted its resident Jewish population, many rich Jewish families fled the country. Their possessions, including valuable artwork, were confiscated in their absence. Kronthal reportedly brokered deals to purchase this artwork back from the Nazis. During his 4 years with Speyer & Company, he made multiple trips to Germany and dealt directly with senior members of the Nazi Party, including Hermann Goering and Joseph Goebbels. On one of these trips, Kronthal's darkest secret was observed and noted by the dreaded and highly capable Gestapo secret police. Kronthal was a pedophile and was filmed in compromising circumstances with young boys. The Gestapo were prepared to arrest him for these crimes, but Hermann Goering intervened on his behalf due to their personal relationship. Years later, at the end of World War II, Soviet forces occupied a quarter of Germany, which would later become East Germany. From there, the NKVD was able to seize the Gestapo record archives, as well as penetrate most of the West German government, including its intelligence organizations. Through one of their agents, named Heinz Felf, who was a founding member of the West German BND, the Gestapo reports on Kronthal's activities in the late 1930s soon came to the attention of the Soviets. This priceless information allowed them to surreptitiously film him with a young boy while he was serving as the chief of station in Bern between 1947 and 1952, and subsequently blackmail him. Kronthal was caught and became their unwilling agent as the CIA grew at the very beginning of the Cold War. Just a few weeks before his death, Kronthal was promoted to Deputy Director for Training at the agency's headquarters. In this position, he probably had access to and oversight of an incredible array of information that would have been priceless to the Soviets. Just as an example, he would probably have known the identities of all trainees and candidates for employment, who among them was being prepared specifically for assignments directed against the Soviets, and the most up-to-date tradecraft methods being developed and taught. There are also two different versions of what happened on the night of March 30th, leading to his death. The authors of Widows wrote that Allen Dulles learned Kronthal was under Soviet control and invited him into his own home for dinner that night. There, the director confronted him with that information, after which he returned home and took his own life. A slightly different scenario was described in the book Poisoner in Chief by Stephen Kinzer, which was published in 2019. Kinzer wrote that besides Dulles, there were also 2 agency employees inside the home covertly monitoring the conversation. And furthermore, that Dulles provided Kronthal with a vial of poison concocted by none other than Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who would go on to lead the infamous MK Ultra program in later years. Dulles then strongly but tacitly encouraged him to use the poison rather than face a public trial or scandal, which is exactly what Kronthal did. Now, the other version of events appears in the recently declassified CIA investigative memoranda. This version shows that the agency investigated Kronthal over allegations of homosexual activity, but ultimately cleared him of any wrongdoing, even though he apparently admitted to at least one homosexual act during a polygraph examination. However, investigators decided that his activities were part of his past and should not affect his continued employment with the agency. This was likely because of his close working relationship with Allen Dulles rather than an independent, evidence-based finding. But during the so-called Lavender Scare, investigators working for Senator Joseph McCarthy pursued a separate investigation in 1951 into suspected homosexuals employed by both the State Department and Central Intelligence Agency, and obtained a signed statement from a soldier who served with Kronthal during the war and acknowledged the two had been together on 2 occasions. At the time, homosexuals employed within the U.S. government were considered by McCarthy and others to be subversives. When he learned that he was under investigation and was likely to be publicly identified, humiliated, and probably fired, Kronthal killed himself. One CIA employee reported that he read a copy of one of the suicide notes, and in it, Kronthal explained his decision was based on pending accusations from Senator McCarthy. These memoranda all refute the allegations published in Widows and state that he was never suspected of being a mole or working with the Soviets. Also, that there was no indication he had dinner with Allen Dulles the night before his death, nor any record of Kronthal even traveling to Germany between 1934 and 1938, when he was alleged to have been caught in a Gestapo trap. After his death, several of Kronthal's family members acknowledged that they'd been aware of his homosexuality since he was a young teenager. At the time, the act was not just frowned upon, but was a punishable offense within the military and government, so he naturally would have tried to keep it secret from friends, family, and colleagues. There are some apparent holes in both stories. For one thing, the authors of Widows rely almost entirely on unnamed sources and provide very little in the way of references, footnotes, or endnotes to demonstrate the research they conducted prior to writing. That doesn't mean it's all fabricated, of course, but it doesn't help corroborate or validate any of their allegations. For another, the coroner did not find any evidence of narcotics or organic poison in Kronthal's system during the autopsy. The blood test used at the time would not have detected cyanide from an OSSL tablet, according to the CIA reports, but the cyanide would also have left a bluish tinge on his lips and skin. And no one observed a bluish tint to his skin, and instead described him as having a waxy complexion with a small amount of perspiration still present on his forehead. Now, is this because he didn't take cyanide after all, but perhaps a new, undetectable poison devised by Dr. Gottlieb for this exact situation? Or did the coroner miss a seemingly obvious indicator of Kronthal's possible cause of death, one that was also missed by a pair of veteran CIA employees who knew enough about cyanide to recognize the packaging of an L tablet? As for the CIA's version of events, according to the 1989 memoranda, Kronthal's agency security file was destroyed in 1970, and the results of his polygraph examination were destroyed in 1980. The Washington, D.C. Metro Police incident file was also destroyed 27 years after it was filed, per their own policies. And last but not least, the coroner's report was destroyed as well. So besides the investigative memoranda, much of his personnel file was declassified in 2020, including his professional evaluations, travel vouchers, and the like. But the security file and polygraph results would undoubtedly have shed light on the circumstances that led to his demise. Because of their absence, the investigation relied almost entirely on interviews with people who knew Kronthal in some way and their memories more than 3.5 decades later. So, although they produced a lot of paperwork, they also have very little original documentation to corroborate the witness statements. As for the statement that there was no evidence he even traveled to Germany in the mid to late 1930s, this appears to be based on his own self-reported foreign travel during the application process. It's true that the forms released in 2020 only showed he reported travel to England, France, and Italy during that period. But he may have had good reason not to report any trips to Germany for illicit purposes. Furthermore, how likely is it that air travel records from the 1930s would be readily accessible to investigators in 1989? Probably not very likely. And what if Kronthal flew to England or France, but then continued on to Germany on the same trip without reporting it? That may not be probable, but it is entirely possible. There's no indication in the available paperwork that his passport was examined for entry and exit stamps, so this is another potentially unresolved aspect of the entire situation. But the investigators didn't just look into the allegations, they also looked into the sources of the allegations. According to their findings, one of the author's main sources for information on Kronthal's work for the NKVD was most likely a disgruntled former CIA employee named Justin O'Donnell, who was fired in 1962. Information may also have come from a debriefing of Otto John, a West German lawyer and head of one of their intelligence services, the Office for the Protection of the Constitution. Otto John's story is also very strange, as he defected to East Germany in 1954, the year after Kronthal's death, only returned to West Germany in 1955, where he was convicted and imprisoned for treason. I'll probably do an entire episode on Otto John at some point. Author William Corson also claimed to have worked closely with Allen Dulles in the mid-1950s as an informal aide, while Corson was still in the U.S. Marine Corps. The CIA report strongly refutes this and repeatedly states that Corson never worked for or with the agency in any meaningful way. The end result of both the book and the declassified CIA reports is that both sides pointed a finger at the other, but neither side produced the kind of original documentation that would unequivocally support their claims. If, in fact, Kronthal was fully compromised by the Soviets and working under their control, then he could have potentially provided them with incredibly valuable information. During the earliest years of the Cold War, both the CIA and British MI6 worked to infiltrate teams of agents behind the Iron Curtain to set up intelligence collection networks and resistance cells in case of war against the rising threat of the Soviet Union. Has this podcast given you a renewed interest in the history of the Cold War? Do you want to share that interest with others? Well, now there's a fun and interactive way to introduce your family and friends to the topic. I'm talking about 15-Minute Cold War, a new strategy-based card game for up to 4 players. As one of the great powers during the Cold War, use your armed forces to attack opponents while defending yourself with military, scientific, and economic assets. There are also wild cards based on real events and people to keep things interesting. For example, how will Oleg Penkovsky weaken one side or strengthen another? Players don't have to know any history to start playing, just learn the color codes and point values of each card. My 8-year-old daughter understood the game mechanics within a few minutes and has already won 2 rounds against her mom and I. There's also an expansion edition available for game nights of up to 8 players. Find it at 15mincoldwar.com. That's 15min coldwar.com. And make sure to follow at 15Minute Cold War on Instagram. These missions were tragically unsuccessful, and many Eastern Europeans who were trained, equipped, and armed by the Western intelligence services were captured or killed almost immediately after parachuting into their home countries again. Some of these deaths can certainly be attributed to Kim Philby, the MI6 agent and Soviet spy, but can all of them? What if they were betrayed far in advance by someone who knew the names and statuses of everyone being trained by the agency for clandestine operations in Eastern Europe? The possibilities are staggering. If any of this were the case, then it's hard to imagine the kind of long-term damage Kronthal would have done had he continued in his career with the agency past March 31st, 1953. What if he'd one day been selected as the next director of Central Intelligence? That was a real possibility at the time. He had the right background, education, experience, and connections to rise to the top. Whatever the case, James Cromthal's story is an excellent example of the levels of doubt and intrigue that James Angleton would later name the Wilderness of Mirrors. The next mystery isn't the death of a single person, but of 57 of them. Every passenger and every crew member on board Civil Air Transport Flight B908 in 1964. Civil Air Transport was founded in 1946 by General Claire Chennault, initially as a regional airline serving much of Southeast Asia. Chennault spent much of World War II in China with the Flying Tigers, a famous group of volunteer American pilots who flew into combat against the Japanese Air Force over China. Chennault remained in China after the war, where he established himself as a successful businessman. But he never forgot that service to his country came first. Within a few years of its founding, Civil Air Transport was purchased by the CIA as a front company to establish both a physical presence and an airlift capacity in Southeast Asia. Over the coming decades, CAT flew regular passenger flights all over the region and also served to airdrop supplies, arms, and clandestine operatives in hot zones throughout the hemisphere. More than 200 CAT employees were killed during its operational lifespan, and CAT claimed the title of World's Most Shot At Airline. On June 20th, 1964, Flight B908 was a Curtiss C-46 Commando, which had been refitted as a passenger plane, departed Taichung, Taiwan, for the capital city of Taipei. Just minutes later, it inexplicably pulled hard to the left and descended rapidly to crash into a rice paddy at a steep angle. There were no survivors among the 57 souls on board. Taiwanese authorities blamed engine failure, but crash investigators from CAT made a number of startling discoveries in the wreckage. After first examining the engine and control cables, they found nothing to indicate a mechanical malfunction that could have caused the crash. A review of the pilot's records showed they were both very experienced, with thousands of hours flying the very same Curtiss C-46 aircraft. Additionally, they were both judged mentally and physically healthy during their most recent medical examinations. So pilot error, especially by both pilots simultaneously, appeared highly unlikely. However, at the crash site, 2 loaded and cocked .45 ACP pistols were found, along with 2 Taiwanese Navy radar manuals, which had been hollowed out to fit the pistols inside. The pilot in command, named Bengi Lin, had entry and exit wounds in his head, and his second in command, M.H. Kung, had been stabbed with a 3-inch long steel spike which was still embedded in his body. A Taiwanese Navy officer named Lieutenant Seng Yang had boarded the flight in uniform with no luggage, and his unit at the Pinghu Ship Building Yard reported that 2 pistols were missing from the armory. His ticket had been purchased for him by Wang Xing Yi, who also boarded the flight. Although no one knows for certain what happened, it appears that Lieutenant Seng Yang attempted to hijack the flight and force the pilots to fly across the Taiwan Strait to mainland China. If so, he may have been defecting, or perhaps he'd been an agent in place for the People's Republic of China all along. It seems unlikely that he was on a deliberate suicide mission. But whatever happened, his actions led to the deaths of 57 people that afternoon, including 20 Americans. The story is now a little more than a footnote in history and barely remembered or even documented anywhere, so it seems unlikely we'll ever learn what his motivations were or his intentions. Next, we're going to move up to April 1976, back in the United States. One of the best double agents in U.S. Army history died under mysterious circumstances in a hotel room in 1976. On April 13th of that year, Chief Warrant Officer 3, Ralph Sigler, was found dead in his room at the Holiday Inn in Jessup, Maryland, just outside of Fort Meade. He had an electrical cord wrapped around both arms and plugged into an outlet. The U.S. Army and Maryland State Police ruled it a suicide, albeit a very bizarre one. Sigler was born in Czechoslovakia and was originally named Rudolf Siglar with a C in 1928 before immigrating to the United States in his youth. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1947. His mother continued to reside in Czechoslovakia behind the Iron Curtain. Combined with his later work as an electronics expert, this made him an attractive target for the Soviet KGB and an attractive asset for the U.S. Army and FBI as well. In 1966, Sigler was approached by Army counterintelligence and tasked with the incredibly difficult mission of being recruited by the Soviets as a double agent. He succeeded and, beginning in 1968, fed the Soviets falsified documents related to the Army's radar and missile systems. He met with his Soviet handlers in Zurich, Vienna, and Mexico City, among other places. In addition to providing false information, he was also able to identify Soviet intelligence personnel. The cash rewards he received from the Soviets were turned over to the Army. But unbeknownst even to his Army intelligence handlers, he was also recruited separately by the FBI to run their own Soviet double agent, Colonel Rudolf Herrmann. This led to Sigler failing his next scheduled Army polygraph examination since he was deliberately withholding information. In 1979, Sigler's widow, Ilse Sigler, filed a lawsuit against members of the U.S. Army Intelligence Agency's Special Operations Division, plus an FBI agent and parties unknown from the CIA for the wrongful death of her husband. She sought $100 million in damages, plus the return of some of her husband's possessions. In her lawsuit, she stated that around 1974, when her husband was nearing his retirement from the U.S. Army, he began drafting his memoirs about his time working as a double agent against the Soviet Union. In March 1976, his superiors learned of his intentions to publish his memoirs and insisted that he be debriefed and undergo a polygraph examination. It appears they believed that he would be including highly sensitive information in his memoirs and might have been holding on to classified documents to aid him in his research and writing. Sigler arrived at Fort Meade for a polygraph examination, which he failed. According to his widow's lawsuit, he was then confined to a pair of rooms at the Holiday Inn for the next 9 days as he was debriefed by Army counterintelligence personnel. He eventually consented to a search of his home and called Ilse to tell her to allow an FBI agent to enter the home and retrieve these documents on April 8, 1976. 5 days later, Sigler was found dead in his room. Ilse always believed that either the investigators resorted to torture in an effort to extract a confession from him, or that he became so despondent after days of harsh interrogations that he chose to end his life with what was available to him in the hotel room. However, a trio of investigative reporters came to a very different conclusion. In the book Widows, which we just discussed a few minutes ago, the authors William Corso and Susan and Joseph Trento posit that Sigler may have in fact been murdered by the KGB as revenge for manipulating them for so many years. They wrote that Sigler's polygraph examination was reported to the Soviets by another mole at Fort Meade, and the KGB realized that their best agent in the U.S. Army had been feeding them disinformation all along. In a rare and incredibly brazen move, a Wentworth team was dispatched to find Sigler, and he was electrocuted to death in his hotel room. There is no indication the culprits were ever found. In 1980, Ilse Sigler's lawsuit was dismissed, and she spent many years continuing to search for the truth about her husband's death until she passed away in 2009. In 1989, Sigler's death was featured in an episode of the television series Unsolved Mysteries. Just as we mentioned before, the book Widows made some very startling claims, but did not have a great deal of documentation to back those claims up. There are some very gruesome photos of Sigler's death. You can see the electrical wires wrapped around his arms while he's in a chair in the hotel room, the crime scene photos that were provided to them. But those don't really give an indication as to whether it was a very unusual suicide or an intentional murder by someone else. So this is yet another story that is probably never going to be conclusively answered to anyone's satisfaction. Next up is the story of a death in London in the summer of 1982. On the morning of June 17th that year, a passerby walking underneath the Blackfriars Bridge, which spanned the Thames River in central London, noticed an orange and yellow rope tied to the northern arch in a place he'd never seen one before. He looked over the railing and saw that a body was dangling from the other end of the rope just above the waterline. Police arrived on the scene a few minutes later and retrieved the body, which was a man in his early 60s dressed in a suit. When they searched him, they found thousands of British pounds worth of cash, 2 wallets, 2 expensive Patek Philippe watches, a passport, and several stones, plus 2 halves of a brick in different pockets, apparently for weighing the corpse down. The passport was from Italy in the name Gian Robert Calvini. Police initially believed it to be a suicide and did not treat the area as a crime scene at first. However, there were a few oddities about the scene that were noticed early on. For one thing, for Calvini to have hanged himself from that location underneath the bridge, he would have had to climb over the bridge's parapet, then climb down a very tall and very narrow ladder, then slide across some construction scaffolding at the bottom, including crossing a 3-foot gap between 2 of the structures. After that, he'd have to tie the rope to the underside of the arch and around his neck while balanced in a precarious position. And furthermore, he would have had to make the entire trip carrying the rope and with more than 12 pounds of rocks and bricks in his pockets. Another unusual circumstance was that the ladder leading down to the site was very rusty, but the dead man's hands didn't have any residue of that rust to be found. The following day, police learned from the Italian embassy that the passport was a fake, and the man's real name was Roberto Calvi, not Robert Calvini. He was the chairman of the Banco Ambrosiano in Milan, Italy, and had recently been convicted in an Italian court on charges of fraud. While he was out of prison and appealing the conviction, he fled the country and ended up in London after a roundabout trip through Europe. The Banco Ambrosiano was one of Italy's largest private banks and had grown to that stature in just a few short years under Calvi's leadership. But after a series of bad investments, it was now $1.8 billion in debt, and Calvi had just been fired from his position as chairman by the board of directors. One of the biggest shareholders of Banco Ambrosiano was the Institute for Works of Religion. That was the official name for the Vatican's bank. A month after his death, a British jury ruled the death a suicide after a one-day hearing. Calvi's family contested this ruling and, over the coming years, appealed to British and Italian courts, hired a very expensive private investigations firm, and contracted a pair of Scotland Yard forensic scientists to determine what might have happened. Between 1982 and 2002, forensic science improved significantly, and after Calvi's body was exhumed in 1998, additional clues from his clothing and his remains convinced the family that he had definitely not climbed down under the bridge by himself. The most telling evidence was the presence of 2 separate fractures to his neck, indicating that he'd probably been strangled to death somewhere else and then hung from the bridge by an unknown person. So it seems pretty clear that Calvi was murdered, but the question remained, by whom? As it turned out, there were many potential suspects because Calvi had moved within the circles of some very powerful and very dangerous people. These included the Vatican, the Italian Mafia, and a clandestine Freemason group known as Propaganda Do, or P2. Propaganda Do started out in the late 1800s as a Masonic lodge operating in Italy, but after a period of latency following World War II, the lodge transformed into something else entirely under the leadership of Licio Gelli. Gelli was an outspoken fascist and supporter of Mussolini during the war, and afterwards was rumored to be on the payroll of either British or American intelligence, or possibly both. Beginning in 1971, he quickly turned the lodge from a Masonic organization into both an anti-communist and criminal enterprise connected to the highest levels of Italy's government. Among the members of Propaganda Do were the leaders of all 3 Italian intelligence agencies and future Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, and the senior editor of Italy's largest daily newspaper. There were also several senior ministers and more than 50 admirals and generals from every branch of the Italian military. In 1976, just 5 years after Gelli took control of the lodge, it was officially disbanded by order of the Freemason leadership. Besides its criminal enterprises, there was evidence that Propaganda Do intended to operate as a shadow government within Italy and was even planning to take control of the country in the event that the Italian Communist Party won any major electoral victories. In 2005, 23 years after Calvi's death, 4 men and 1 woman were brought to trial in Italy for his murder. The suspects included one of Calvi's former bodyguards, a member of the Italian Mafia, 2 businessmen, one of whom was a senior member of Propaganda Do, and one of their former girlfriends. Prosecutors alleged that Calvi had been laundering money for the Mafia through Banco Ambrosiano and had lost a great deal of their funds during the bank's downfall. It's also believed that Propaganda Do suffered a similar loss and may have wanted Calvi dead as well. But the evidence against the 5 suspects was all circumstantial, and after a nearly 2-year trial, they were acquitted on all charges. Even now, more than 40 years after his death, the crime remains unsolved. There's one more interesting footnote about Propaganda Do. As I said at the beginning, Calvi was found hanging beneath the Blackfriars Bridge in London, and the members of Propaganda Do referred to themselves as the Frati Neri, which is Italian for Black Friars. Is it possible Calvi was hung under the bridge as a warning to that group, or was he hung there by the group themselves as a way of signing their own work? One of the most interesting theories about his death is that he was murdered at the hands, or at least the order, of someone within British intelligence or the British government. The reason for this is complex, but is rooted in the war over the Falklands Islands, which had just concluded a few weeks before Calvi died. The Falkland Islands is a small chain in the South Atlantic Ocean. It's long been claimed by both the United Kingdom and Argentina, which refers to them as the Islas Malvinas. The British had occupied the islands since 1833 and consistently rejected claims by Argentina over sovereignty for the next 150 years. Finally, on April 2, 1982, Argentinian troops landed on the island and quickly overwhelmed the small garrison of approximately 50 Royal Marines with relatively few casualties on both sides. A naval task force set out 3 days later from the UK and would take 3 weeks to make it all the way to the waters surrounding the Falklands. During that time, approximately 10,000 Argentine troops occupied the islands. The Royal Navy was significantly more powerful than their Argentine counterpart and brought 2 aircraft carriers as part of the task force. But Argentina did have one major advantage in this conflict. Just a few months before, their 2nd Air Naval Squadron had taken delivery of 5 new French-built Dassault Breguet Super Étendard jets, with 9 more on the way. They had also purchased 5 brand new Exocet anti-ship missiles, again with more on the way. You wouldn't necessarily expect just 5 jets and 5 missiles to have a major impact on such a large conflict, but they very nearly resulted in an Argentine victory in the war. Even though the qualified Étendard pilots all had fewer than 100 hours each in those jets, and none had ever live-fired an Exocet missile before, they managed to deal tremendous damage to the British Royal Navy in a series of engagements. They sank the frigate HMS Sheffield, the container ship MV Atlantic Conveyor, and damaged the destroyer HMS Glamorgan. Although Argentina ultimately lost the war for the Falklands, the Exocet missiles received worldwide attention after their incredible performance. What did any of this have to do with Calvi's death? Well, because of international sanctions put in place once the Falklands War began, Argentina could not transfer money or purchase any of the additional Exocet missiles they'd intended to buy from France. It's been reported that the reason Roberto Calvi was in London was to facilitate transfers of funds from Argentina to Aerospatiale, the manufacturer of the Exocet. Some of these missiles were already in place in Chile, but would not be delivered to Argentina until they were paid for. Calvi was using Banco Ambrosiano to move the funds around in a complicated series of transfers to hide both the buyer and the seller to avoid further sanctions. The 5th and final Exocet in Argentina's inventory had been fired on June 12, 1982. Calvi died just 6 days later. Some people believe that the British Secret Intelligence Service was aware of his activities and wouldn't permit any further loss of life in the Falklands due to the continued use of Exocet missiles, which could only be bought with Calvi's assistance. There is no firm evidence to support this theory, although means, motive, and opportunity are certainly all there. But Calvi also had many other powerful people who would benefit from his demise, so at this point, once again, it's unlikely that the mystery of his death will ever be solved. Next up is a name that many of you are probably already familiar with. Edward Lee Howard was known as the only Central Intelligence Agency employee to defect to the Soviet Union. Hired by the CIA in January 1981, his first 2.5 years with the agency were spent in an extensive training pipeline to prepare him for assignment to Moscow, which was the CIA's premier overseas post. His wife Mary was also trained so they could operate as a team, which was a common practice for CIA personnel assigned to the embassy in Moscow. As part of his preparations for this new posting, Howard was read on to some numerous, incredibly sensitive operations taking place in Moscow, including information on some of the CIA's human intelligence sources whom he would be taking over. Along with several other case officers, he also completed training for a high-risk subterranean cable tapping mission, which was eventually completed by Ken Seacrest. Then, not long before he was to travel to Moscow, Howard failed 4 separate polygraph examinations in a row due to past issues with drug use and petty theft while he was living and working in South America with the Peace Corps. This led to his humiliating dismissal from the agency in June of 1983 and a return home to New Mexico. He took a job with the state government there as an economic analyst for the New Mexico Legislative Finance Committee and, for all appearances, attempted to put the past behind him. Even so, he had a run-in with law enforcement in 1984 when he was arrested and sentenced to probation for brandishing a firearm in Santa Fe. But this was hardly the case. While vacationing with his wife in Europe, Howard met with members of the Soviet KGB far from the watchful eyes of American law enforcement or counterintelligence personnel. He was able to give them valuable clues to identify one of the CIA's best-placed agents, Adolf Tolkachev, now known as the billion-dollar spy. Tolkachev was arrested in 1985, interrogated, and executed the following year. The U.S. government was unaware of these meetings until a Soviet defector named Vitaly Yurchenko described someone who could only be Howard to his CIA debriefers, and the FBI began investigating and surveilling him in New Mexico. Howard was anything but an easy surveillance target, however. He had received extensive training from the CIA in counter-surveillance and was well aware of his surroundings at all times. Once he realized the net was closing in on him, he effected a dramatic escape and defection. He was trained in the use of the so-called jack-in-the-box inflatable dummy for thwarting surveillance, and he created a homemade version using a wig stand, baseball cap, and jacket. One night, driving home from dinner, he leapt from the passenger seat of the car into the desert, and his wife placed the dummy in his seat so that it appeared the couple were both still driving home together in the car. Although the dummy looks ridiculous and outlandish up close, it served its purpose when viewed from a trailing vehicle in the dark of night. The FBI team assigned to him didn't realize he was missing until he was already on his way to Helsinki, Finland, and then on to Moscow. Howard lived a lonely existence in Moscow, longing to be with his wife and son, who stayed behind. Over the years, he attempted to immigrate to Hungary and Sweden so as to reunite with his wife and son, but both attempts were thwarted by those governments, likely due to diplomatic pressure from the U.S. government. In 1995, he published his memoirs titled Safe House, the compelling memoirs of the only CIA spy to seek asylum in Russia. Howard was treated well for the most part by the Soviet government, but there has always been speculation that the defector Yurchenko was a deliberate operation by the Soviets to give up Howard and thus deflect attention away from another far more valuable source within the CIA, Aldrich Ames. In 2002, Howard passed away alone in his apartment in Moscow, apparently from a broken neck after falling down a flight of stairs. His death leads one to wonder what the Justice Department meant when they released a statement saying Howard would never find permanent sanctuary from American justice, even in the most remote corners of the earth. These are just a few of the mysterious and unexplained deaths in the world of espionage. I'll be featuring a lot more in future episodes, including the death of John Paisley in the Chesapeake Bay in 1979 and the apparent suicide of an Argentinian federal prosecutor named Alberto Nisman in 2015. Stand by for those episodes coming soon. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my pages on Instagram at Spycraft 101 and at cold.war.stamps. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.